You talked about the ideology of Pakistan, which your latest book deals about. So when we talk about India, we say it's a civilizational state. Pakistan, on the other hand, is an ideological state as you define it, and the ideology is religion, Islam, Sharia. How do you see that, and how it has shaped Pakistan since the beginning?
Ayub Khan described ideology of Pakistan as Islam, but it goes beyond Islam. It is Urdu, it is army, it is denial of democracy, it is denial of plurality. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, in a speech in Meerut in 1888, said that Hindus and Muslims are two different nations, and in the event of departure of the British, unless one has thrust the other down and conquered it, there will never be peace. The Muslim League did not represent the Muslims.
Yes.
It was a party of the zamindars, the feudal lords. In 1937 elections, which were the first elections held under the British, the League secured only 4.8% of Muslim votes. So it had no representative credentials. It was certainly built up after 1940 by the British. As Wali Khan, in a famous statement, mentioned, he said that he has been a Pashtun for 6,000 years, he has been a Muslim for 1,300 years, and he has been a Pakistani for 25 years.
5 years.
So these identities always existed. What ideology of Pakistan did was to ignore the national and linguistic identities which pre-existed Pakistan.
The economy is in a very bad shape in Pakistan. We all know about the polity. There has been army rule every now and then. Situation is not good on any parameter. How do you see the future of Pakistan given all these constraints, all these problems?
The economy, Pakistan is on 25th IMF assistance package. And despite 25 IMF assistance packages, its economy remains extremely fragile. Flow of Chinese money to Pakistan has slowed down because the Chinese don't like to write free checks.
Yes.
They are careful with their money.
Hello and welcome once again to Kitabi Baatein, a podcast where we make sense of India and the world through books. My guest today is Ambassador Dinkar P. Srivastav, an ex-diplomat. He has an illustrious career in foreign services and is going to have a long introduction. He served as India's ambassador to Iran during 2011 to 15, where he negotiated the MOU or Indian participation in Chabahar port. He also served in diplomatic mission to various countries, including Pakistan, USA, and the European Union. He has been part of several key diplomatic assignments during his tenure, which includes Director of UN Political Division in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was also part of India's successful lobbying efforts to prevent internationalization of the Kashmir issue. He was also a member of the Indian delegations to the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993 and the International Court of Justice in the case of Ariel incident of 1999. Other than his career in foreign services, he is also author of two very insightful books on Pakistan and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, his latest being Pakistan, Ideologies, Strategies, and Interest, and his first book, Forgotten Kashmir, The Other Side of the Line of Control. Ambassador Srivastav, it's an honor to have you on Kitabi Baatein.
Abhishek, thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, you have as I said, an illustrious career as a diplomat. You have been to many countries. Now, both of your books relate to Pakistan. What made you choose Pakistan as a subject for your books?
I served in Pakistan. I was in Karachi in the early 90s. I was there when, in the aftermath of Babri Masjid, they ransacked the Consul General's residence and we had to arrange for evacuation of 112 women and children at 12 hours notice. On return to India for 8 years as director and then joint secretary UN Political and Ministry of External Affairs, and I dealt with Kashmir and Pakistan. So after retirement, I thought I should put this perspective in some form where it could be accessible to larger readership. Right.
Of course, as I can see through your books, it carries a lot of insights which, with due respect to all other authors, don't really have that much of insight in their books. So you talked about the ideology of Pakistan, which your latest book deals about. So when we talk about India, we say it's a civilizational state. Pakistan, on the other hand, is an ideological state as you define it. And the ideology is religion, Islam, Sharia. How do you see that and how it has shaped Pakistan since the beginning?
Pakistan has no history. It began with an idea. Ayub Khan described ideology of Pakistan as Islam, but it goes beyond Islam. It is Urdu, it is army, it is denial of democracy, it is denial of plurality, and of course it is denial of the minority rights. Jinnah went to East Pakistan sometime in early 1948, and in a speech in Dhaka University, he said that Urdu will be the only official language of Pakistan. At that time, Urdu was spoken only by 4.4% of the population, right, who are Muhajirs. Now their number has gone up to 7%. Bengalis were 56%. Jinnah justified this on the ground that Urdu was closest to the Muslim culture. And next 20 years, Pakistan elite, West Pakistan elite, which is today's Pakistan, denied the national and linguistic aspirations of the Bengalis, and that resulted in Bangladesh.
Yes.
And you see the same struggle today in Balochistan. The ideology of Pakistan, which initially came from the clergy and the political leaders, now there are multiple actors.
Correct.
So each jihadi group has its own ideas of what that ideology is. So, and hence you see the conflict within Pakistan today.
Right.
So the victims are not just the minorities, but today also the majority community in Pakistan.
But when you say that different players are, bringing out their own ideologies, do you still think that the root cause or the root ideology, the basic ideology is still Islam and Sharia?
And those multiple players are all those who want to take Pakistan closer and closer to the 7th century view of the world.
Right.
So the role of the religion has deepened and continues to deepen.
Correct.
So in the 70s, the religious parties came up with the slogan of Nizam-e-Mustafa, which is the kind of, Islamic rule.
Right. That was under Zia-ul Haq, if I'm not wrong.
Zia-ul Haq came after that, as a result of that agitation.
Right.
And he adopted it as a state philosophy.
Right.
Now, Imran Khan talks about Riyasat-e-Madina.
Yes.
And you also have the army chief.
Correct.
So there's a competition amongst these different multiple players, and which are moving towards Pakistan increasingly to an extremist version of Islam.
So we'll talk about Imran Khan as well and General Munir as well. But one of the things related to the idea and the history of Pakistan, we usually say that Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the one responsible for the creation of Pakistan. But as your book suggests, the idea of Pakistan was probably already there since many decades back. So it started with Sayyid Ahmad Khan, followed by Ulama Iqbal. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah came to the picture actually much later. He gained prominence in 1930s and 40s. So was the idea a very old one? Was the ideology always there among the Muslim elites or other sections of Muslims? Because Sayyid Ahmad Khan talked about the two-nation theory way back in 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. So how do you see this thought being already there since the end of the 19th century and culminating in Pakistan in 47?
Two-nation theory is a later development. It came in 1940 with Jinnah's speech at Lahore. Almost 80 years before that, 60 years before that, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, in a speech in Meerut in 1888, said that Hindus and Muslims are two different nations, And in the event of departure of the British, unless one has thrust the other down and conquered it, there will never be peace.
Please.
So this was the earliest statement of the two-nation theory, though at that time Muslim League was not even born.
Right.
So the idea began in the minds of the Muslim elite of North India, the Ashrafs.
Yes.
And they were very conscious, like Sir Syed Ahmad, that Muslims are the past rulers, and therefore they had entitlement to, or they had a prerogative to power. And this was the basis of the, this Pakistan, demand for Pakistan. If you cannot be the ruler, which was not possible given the majority being a different community in a democracy, then the preference was partition. Iqbal came a little later, and Iqbal in his speech in 1930 at Allahabad, as president of the Muslim League, said that in Islam, state and religion are integral to each other. His second statement was that he said that he did not want the same fate to befall Islam which had earlier befallen Christianity. And he mentioned that with the Reformation, the hold of Vatican over Christian principalities was weakened, and within each state the role of religion weakened. Right. So he did not want the same fate to befall Islam, and he felt, or he feared, that the rise of nation states will divide the Muslim Ummah.
Right.
Now, if you look at it in the contemporary context, his opposition to nationalism must have been very convenient to the British.
Yes.
Because the main challenge to their colonial rule came from the idea of nationalism.
Correct.
And nationalism was sweeping rest of Asia and Middle East.
Right.
So there's a complete convergence between the Muslim League politics and the political interests of the British.
Right.
And the British used League to counterbalance or checkmate the Congress. And when they realized that their rule could not continue in India, their preference was to divide the country. This was a punishment to Congress and to India, because it was Congress which was asking the British to leave.
Right.
To leave.
So this is an interesting point, as you mentioned that, so we see two parties, the Muslim League and the Britishers. Now the usual narrative we have been fed with is that the Britishers divided India and Pakistan. That was a parting gift to India. Yet we see these two forces of, as I said, Muslim League and the Britishers. How do you think these two forces played out in the eventual breakup of India?
The Muslim League did not represent the Muslims.
Yes.
It was a party of the Zamindars, the feudal lords. In 1937 elections, which were the first elections held under the British, the League secured only 4.8% of Muslim votes. So it had no representative credentials. It was certainly built up after 1940 by the British. And this came in a reaction to Congress's demand was by Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, when the war broke out, Gandhiji asked the Viceroy to make a clear statement that the British would leave India after the war. And only then he said the Congress will support the war effort.
Yes.
The League supported the British, and this tilted the balance. And progressively, the British policy veered more and more towards the Muslim League.
Right.
And the League, which had hardly any representative credentials, was granted its demand for Pakistan without a plebiscite.
Right.
Post-partition, we hear so much about plebiscite in Kashmir. There was no plebiscite held. in India, undivided India, to ascertain whether the people of India wanted partition, whether Muslims wanted partition.
Correct.
So this was simply a gift by the British to the Muslim League and Jinnah.
So this is again very interesting. So as you mentioned, in 1937, Muslims did not get even 5% of the votes. At the same time, we had many nationalist Muslims, for example, Rafiq Ahmad Kidwai, Maulana Azad, the Ali Baksh Sumru, the Khan brothers. How you think what happened in the last 10 years so aggressively that, ultimately despite being nationalist Muslims and Muslim League not really enjoying a majority, not finding favor with the Muslims themselves, still Jinnah managed to get what he wanted, a homeland for Muslims in the name of Islam.
As you rightly mentioned, these leaders, Maulana Azad, Rafiq Ahmad Kidwai, Allah Baksh Sumro, Khan brothers, they had a lot of following. In the 37 elections, Muslim League could not win a single vote, a single seat in Sindh. In Punjab, it won only one seat. And in NWFP, it was Congress government under Khan brothers.
Yes.
This all changed, and it changed in a short period of 7 years because of the British patronage. I should also mention the role of Maulana Madni. He was the head of the Devband, and he challenged the Muslim League theory of two nations, and he called for Muttahida Qawmiyat, the composite nationalism. But the British, as I mentioned earlier, wanted to, when it became clear that they had to leave, the parting gift was to divide the subcontinent.
Right.
There's a misperception that Cabinet Mission Plan was, as some people say, and the British like to make out, it was the last desperate attempt to keep India united. On the contrary, Cabinet Mission Plan was a blueprint for India's balkanization, not in 2 parts, but in 600 parts, because it also gave the authority to the princely states to decide their own future.
Right. I think, and you mentioned this in book, that the Independence Act talked of 2 countries, not many, countries of the princes, choosing their own. That would have led to the balkanization. So that was clearly a ploy by the British to actually divide India into as many states as possible. And as you rightly mentioned, 600 or so, as there were so many princely states. But anyway, Jinnah did get Pakistan. Now coming to Pakistan, one of the things is you mentioned in the book is the Objectives Resolution adopted by Liaquat Ali Khan, which kind of sealed the destiny of Pakistan polity in accordance with Islam and Sharia. How do you see that, and how do you see the condition of minorities in the context of this resolution in Pakistan?
The Objectives Resolution has played a very major role in Pakistan's history. It was brought by Liaquat Ali Khan in the Constituent Assembly in 1949 and adopted. The resolution proclaims sovereignty of Allah over the entire universe, and it said that His authority is delegated to the state of Pakistan through its people to be exercised in trust given by Him. Now, it has 3 implications. In a democracy, people are sovereign.
Yes.
And people delegate the sovereignty to parliament.
Correct.
When you talk of sovereignty of the divine, you are making a departure from the essential principle of democracy.
Right.
So the ideology of Pakistan denies democracy. The second implication is that when you make the religion of the majority community as the foundation of the constitution, this places the minority rights on a very precarious perch, which is what happened in Pakistan. And third, this resolution also is now affecting the lives of the majority community members.
Right.
Because the resolution said that the Muslims will be enabled to order their lives in accordance with injunctions of Quran and Sunnah.
Right.
So the state had assumed the role in the private lives of the citizens. And this is the beginning of Pakistan's problem today. Now, this objectives resolution, which was brought into the operative part of the constitution by Bhutto in 1973. This was the third. It has been objectives resolution has been part of every constitution of Pakistan. There have been three constitutions: 56, 62, 73.
73.
Much has changed in Pakistan. This is the only constant feature, and its role has kept on increasing. So in 73, Bhutto made it the operative part of constitution, and Zia gave it overriding role over fundamental rights. And even after departure of Zia, this was not challenged.
Right.
So objectives resolution is now the foundational principle of Pakistan state. And this was cited in 2017 judgment of Pakistan Supreme Court in dismissing Nawaz Sharif government despite the, huge majority it enjoyed. So the resolution has laid the basis for an Islamic Pakistan
Yes.
where the state has overarching authority, both on state functions as well as the lives of the individuals.
Right. So it's a religion which is basically defining constitution, the lives of people, practically everything. At the same time, we see that the demand for Pakistan came because, as Jinnah said, the Muslims should have a separate homeland, and it was a religion which would unite, Muslims across the entire India. Yet we see that Pakistan as a country, when we say they are not exactly one people, they are different segments. We already saw in the case of Bangladesh, where Bengali nationalism triumphed the feelings for Islam. Now we have different groups such as the Sindhis, the Baloch, the people in Gilgit-Baltistan. So there's not one Pakistan in that sense. There are people with different ideologies, different aspirations. Why do you think it happened that the glue which was supposed to bind all the people together in the name of Islam could not do so? We had the partition in 1971 and we have voices against Pakistan, especially in Balochistan.
These differences which you mentioned, that is the Baloch, the Pashtun, the Sindh, Muhajirs and people from Gilgit-Baltistan, these divisions always existed.
Right.
In fact, as Wali Khan in a famous statement mentioned, he said that he has been a Pashtun for 6,000 years, he has been a Muslim for 1,300 years, and he has been a Pakistani for 25 years.
5 years.
So these identities always existed. What ideology of Pakistan did was to ignore the national and linguistic identities which pre-existed Pakistan.
Right.
And this is what has caused the problem. So first it was the secession of Muslim East Pakistan. It was not just Muslim, they were the majority
Yes.
within Pakistan, and the majority had to split away from that country.
Correct.
And now the same thing is being played out in rest of Pakistan, because the ideology of Pakistan does not accept these different identities.
Yes.
And this is there and reflected in the struggle in Balochistan. And of course, in case of Balochistan, they never accepted the ideology of Pakistan. Khan of Kalar declared independence in 1947, and he was supported by Loya Jirga, the People's Assembly. And incidentally, Pakistan under Jinnah accepted Balochistan as a independent nation, and then Jinnah went back on that and sent the Pakistan army, which is the beginning of now. Since then, there have been 5 military operations.
Right.
I think the most striking part is the Muhajirs who created Pakistan. There was no support for the idea of Pakistan in what is today's Pakistan.
Yes.
The Pakistan movement arose from Muslim minority provinces of UP and Bihar and Central Europe. Now, the Muhajirs who created the country, their main organization, Muhajir Qaumi Movement, which was formed in 80s. The title says Muhajir Qaumi Movement, so it distinguishes Muhajirs as a separate qaum or nation.
Or nation, yes.
So Muhajirs realized that being Pakistanis was not enough. Or you can say that this is, they assumed a different nationality.
Right.
And even though the nomenclature has changed from Muhajir Qaumi Movement to Muttahida Qaumi Movement, Qaum remained in the title.
Correct.
So the nationality question remains alive, and it has become more pronounced.
Right.
Because of the attempt to suppress it.
Right. So we saw a division of Pakistan in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So one of the striking things is that the Bengalis there were a large part of, Pakistan in terms of the population. That is not the case in Balochistan. Baloch people, though it covers a large land mass, but the proportion of Balochis people is I think it's not even 5%. So do you think there can be another division and a disintegration of Pakistan given the number game? Like Baloch are very less, Hindis are very less compared to the overall population. Do you think any such movement, a Bangladesh-like movement can happen again in Pakistan?
Balochistan is only one of the 5 nationalities in Pakistan. And these are Pashtun, who have earlier rejected. It was Pashtun under Khan brothers had opted for their preference was India.
Yes.
Since there was no support till 1942, and Allah Baksh Sumro, in fact, had organized a conference after Lahore conference of Muslim League opposing it. So, what is today's Pakistan? It's not simply a question of Balochistan. There are at least 3 other nationalities who are struggling against Punjabi domination.
Yes.
Punjab accounts for 60% of Pakistan's population. It accounts for 90% of Pakistan army, and it accounts for 100% of eyesight. And it is this domination which is causing friction.
Yes.
So, if the present trend continues, it is not simply Balochistan, it's the other nationalities also which are struggling to assert themselves.
Correct. So one question I had was related to Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Much less talked about. We talk about Kashmir, but Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and we talked about the Karachi Secret Agreement in 49. Do you think that Pakistan has been able to manage to integrate the Pakistan occupied Kashmir within its fold? Because you talked about a lot of disturbances, issues of the people of the POK. So what's your take on POK?
Pakistan calls POK Azad Kashmir.
Yes.
Because they claim that they are the good boys who are keeping to the UN resolutions. The actual reality is just the reverse. POK from the inception was closely controlled by Pakistan.
Yes.
And you mentioned the 1949 agreement. This is called Karachi Agreement.
Karachi Agreement.
This was an agreement between the Muslim Conference and the president of POK, Sardar Ibrahim, on one hand, and Pakistan government on the other hand. And Pakistan forced or persuaded, whichever way you put it, the POK leadership to concede northern areas to Pakistan to be brought under its direct administration. Now, northern area is 85% of POK.
Okay.
Now, this was a major. Now, this agreement was kept secret because it was Pakistan had changed the territorial status quo of POK without plebiscite.
Yes.
So it was a violation of UN Security Council resolutions by Pakistan. This came to light in a judgment of POK High Court in 93, which said that Pakistan had violated UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, and it asked Pakistan to return the northern areas, which are now called Gilgit-Baltistan, to POK. Pakistan refused it, and northern areas of Gilgit-Baltistan continues under Pakistan's direct administrative control, which is the 85% of POK. the last thing, but not the least, the Musalman of Kashmir gets 15 paisa for the same molecule of water for which Musalman of Pakistan gets 1 rupee 10 paisa. Why the discrimination?
Right.
Let me explain. Mangla Dam was constructed in 67. It is located in POK. Pakistan pays 15 paisa for the electricity and the water it gets from Mangla Dam. And it pays 1 rupee 10 paisa for similar projects in Pakistan. And it claims that under Pakistan's constitution, that hydropower royalty, which is 1 rupee 10 paisa, cannot be paid to Azad Kashmir because it is not part of Pakistan. Now that question arises that Mangla Dam was constructed in 67,
Yes.
6 years before Pakistan's constitution came into existence.
Right.
So they had enough time to make provision
Correct.
for payment of, the dues to POK.
Correct.
And if they forgot it then, there have been 25 amendments of Pakistan's constitution since, and there was ample chance to make a provision. They have not done so.
That is
So there is total political control of POK. There's neither azadi nor autonomy,
right.
and there's complete economic exploitation.
Right. So you talked about Azadi, about plebiscite, and these two topics always come up when you talk about India and Pakistan relation. One is the plebiscite, that there should be a plebiscite, which was discussed in 1947, and there are groups who vouch for Azadi of Kashmir, that Kashmir should be an independent state. What do you think about the plebiscite demand and the Azadi? Is there any case for Azadi of Kashmir, or is there any case for conducting a plebiscite?
Pakistan rejected plebiscite in Kashmir every time a formal proposal was made.
Yes.
The first such occasion was 1947. Mountbatten's visit to Lahore on 2nd November 47. Mountbatten suggested plebiscite under UN's auspices. Jinnah refused because the tribal invasion was going on. Tribals had looted, raped and killed Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs and Christians without discrimination. So Jinnah knew that Pakistan will lose the vote.
Right.
The second occasion was 1950. Owen Dixon, the UN mediator, suggested plebiscite, and he also suggested regional plebiscite because a single plebiscite will leave pockets of minorities on either side of political divide and lead to forced migration, which had already happened on a much larger scale in the rest of the subcontinent.
Yes.
Owen Dixon, in his report to the UN, has recorded that India was willing to consider plebiscite. Pakistan refused. And Pakistan said that regional plebiscite was a departure from the principle of single plebiscite, and hence it was refusing. In the same paragraph, Owen Dixon's report to the United Nations mentions, but I am given the impression that Pakistan is willing to accept partition of Kashmir provided it got the valley. So Pakistan was willing to make a departure from the principle of single plebiscite provided it got the valley, and it got the valley without a vote.
Right.
Now this is an important thing to be remembered when we consider the third such occasion and the last. 1953, Sheikh Abdullah's government was dismissed. Pakistan suggested bilateral talks with India, sensing what India's weakness. Prime Minister Bogra came to India. Bogra-Nehru communique was issued committing both sides to plebiscite. Prime Minister Bogra went back to Pakistan on 1st December 1953. He wrote an official letter to Prime Minister Nehru, going back on the idea of plebiscite, and the reason the same they had given in 1950, that regional plebiscite is a departure from the single plebiscite.
Yes.
As I have brought out, this was simply an excuse because they were willing to make the departure provided they got the valley.
Correct.
And they got it without a vote. What was the reason why Pakistan was again and again refusing plebiscite, which has become its official position? Because there was a military operation going on for 10 years, which started in 1950 when Pakistan dismissed Sardar Ibrahim, the first president of POK, and
POK.
that started the Sudan Revolt,
Right.
which lasted almost a decade.
Correct. So,
I have discussed this in greater detail in my book,
yes, of course.
the other Forgotten Kashmir.
Forgotten Kashmir. So, no discussion about Pakistan can be completed without discussing about the army. Army has, for most part of Pakistan's existence, has ruled directly or indirectly. How do you see the army rule so far, and how do you see the future of Pakistan in terms of the army's stronghold over the country?
You know, armies everywhere in the world defend national frontiers. Pakistan's army also claims to defend the ideological frontiers.
Right.
And like much else, this is a self-assumed mandate. Now, this has been used by the army to deepen the role of religion in the country. So in all wars, Pakistan army gave the slogan of jihad and used religious symbols. So Colonel Akbar Khan, who led the tribal raid in Kashmir in 47, assumed the pseudonym of General Tariq. Tariq was the Arab invader who conquered Spain.
Yes.
So this had nothing to do with the liberation of Kashmiris. They were playing out the Islamic, imagery in their minds. Now this has continued till today. There's another very interesting aspect of Pakistan Army. The army has been projected by its supporters in the West as a pro-West force. You've seen how General Asim Munir has been receiving, has been received in
US,
the world's most important capital.
Yes.
In the most crucial stage, Pakistan has gone against the West, and especially Pakistan Army in 1991. At the time of first Gulf War, General Mirza Aslam Beg, the Pakistan Army chief, called for strategic defiance of the West. Now, this was going against the American interests, and it was going against the interests of the Gulf monarchies who have bankrolled Pakistan. Closer home, Pakistan Army encouraged jihadi groups in Kashmir and Afghanistan. The textbooks in Military Staff College in Quetta, written by Brigadier Malik, it says that terror is not a means to achieve an end. It is the end in itself. And the foreword of this textbook was written by General Zia. And General Zia wrote that a Muslim soldier fighting in a Muslim army for a Muslim state cannot become true professional unless he takes on the colors of Allah in all his activities. Now, mark his words. He's not talking of Pakistani soldier fighting in Pakistani army for Pakistani state, which is a legitimate purpose of an army.
Right.
He's talking of a Muslim soldier fighting in a Muslim army for Muslim state, which is a reference to Ummah.
Correct.
And a reference to transnational Islam. So, army has deepened the role of religion. It has created jihadi groups which are now challenging the integrity of Pakistan from within.
Right. And do you think election of Imran Khan, because I think people had many hopes from Imran Khan, he did not probably carry that much of political baggage. He was a sports player and more with a modern outlook. However, we saw that things were not really much different. He was also in touch with the army, and the army did support him. He wasn't with the army itself for about, I think, ISI chief selection and all. How do you see the role of Imran Khan in all these years? Do you think it brought any hope for Pakistan, or do you think it was business as usual?
Imran Khan was army's creation. It was General Zia who sent young Imran Khan to England.
Yes.
With a scholarship to go and improve his cricket. And on return in the 90s, Imran Khan's first port of call was Jamaat-e-Islami chief. So, and he backed Musharraf's coup against Nawaz Sharif. So he has a long, history of collaboration with the army, and this is why the army chief, Bajwa, backed Imran Khan.
Yes.
In 2018 elections, without army support, he would not have come to power.
Right.
And in fact, he had the minority votes. And votes for, the political equations were rigged after the elections to make him the prime minister. Now, he fell out with the army on the issue of appointment of the ISI chief.
Yes.
But these are personality differences. If you look at what he's saying and what General Asim Munir is saying, there's hardly any difference.
Right.
Imran Khan has given a call for Riyasat-e-Madina. And this, of course, there's a political element of political opportunism. His personal lifestyle has nothing to do with Islam. He was a bon vivant, a fellow who led a good life.
Right.
But use of religion for legitimacy, and this is exactly what Asim Munir is doing. So today what you see in Pakistan is a triangular contest between Imran Khan, TTP and Pakistan Army.
Right.
For the ideology of Islam, because if ideology of Pakistan, because if ideology or religion is the ultimate basis of legitimacy and power, there will be competition for it.
Right.
And whosoever can define it will have the upper hand.
Upper hand.
And that explains the current struggle within Pakistan.
Right. So, talking about the recent events, we had this terror attack in Pahalgam. There was a short war, we can say, for a couple of days. General Munir is talking of a nuclear holocaust that he will take half the world away in the event of a war, and they are not, afraid in any way. And their talk of Indus Water Treaty was kept in abeyance by India. So, how do you see the entire scenario playing out? One is about the Indus Water Treaty. And they said that, we will make sure that it never happens. How do you see all of this playing out, especially in the context of Indus Water Treaty?
Indus Water Treaty is an unequal treaty. It was a product of Cold War when Pakistan was aligned with the West, particularly America. And as you know, it's a trilateral agreement, which includes World Bank, which is dominated by the West.
Right.
So it was a very unequal play. And this is reflected in the terms of the treaty, which gave 80% of Indus waters to the lower riparian with 1/7 the population. It has never happened anywhere in the world. And if China, which has never accepted any water sharing agreement with any of the 10 lower riparian states. This includes the ASEAN states. Quite apart from what they are, proposing to do in Tibet. They have a dispute also with ASEAN.
Yes.
Turkey, which is also a close friend of Pakistan, has not entered into any water sharing agreement with the lower riparians, which is Syria and Iraq, over the sharing of waters of Euphrates and Tigris. So, this treaty was unequal. It cannot last, and India has suspended it.
Right.
Now the bluster and the threat that Pakistan will use nuclear weapons, you've seen that during Operation Sindoor, they did not say a word.
Yes.
When India took out their facilities in Islamabad. This is a Noor Khan base.
Right.
And they had to sue for peace. So Pakistan knows that the use of nuclear weapons will be disastrous for that country, which lacks strategic depth to be able to absorb a second strike by India, which will definitely follow. But they have always used the threat of nuclear weapons to get the international community involved in this corner of the world to pressurize India to make concessions to Pakistan.
Right. So the economy is in a very bad shape in Pakistan. We all know about the polity. There has been army rule every now and then. Situation is not good on any parameter. How do you see the future of Pakistan given all these constraints, all these problems, and how do you see the future of Indo-Pak relations?
The economy, Pakistan is on 25th IMF assistance package. And despite 25 IMF assistance packages, its economy remains extremely fragile. It has a foreign exchange reserve of $12 billion. And that $12 billion are there because friendly countries like the Gulf monarchies and
Yes.
China agreed to roll over $16 billion of debt. So if they had called their debt, Pakistan would have gone bankrupt.
Yes.
Now, this dire economic strait has been brought by a combination of two things. One is the Pakistani elite has kept the taxes low. They don't pay taxes. And second is high defense expenditure.
Right.
In my book, the title is Ideologies of Pakistan, because while they talk about Islam as the ideology of Pakistan, they have made a departure from Islam when it comes to economy. The beauty of Islam is the idea of equality.
Right.
And Pakistan has a capitalist economy, and not just a capitalist economy, an economy where the poor are completely marginalized. So you have witnessed the food riots in
Right.
Pakistan in 2022. So it's the combination of underdevelopment, high defense expenditure, and the third condition is climate change.
Right.
And climate change is also going to affect the Indus water and the water available to Pakistan, which depends on rain-fed agriculture.
Right.
So it has a very challenging future. And
Right.
ideology of Pakistan, is that an answer to it? I don't think so, but it's for the people of Pakistan to decide.
To decide. So my last question is related to China actually. And there are many people, many experts who say that for India, actually China is the main problem because Pakistan also gets a lot of support from China. So how do you see the future of India-Pakistan in the context of the Chinese involvement such as CPEC, for example?
The Chinese involvement in Pakistan began in the early 60s as China-India relations started deteriorating. So China was brought into the subcontinent by Pakistan as a counterbalance to India. And China accepted this role and has been playing this role since then.
Yes.
So it has built up Pakistan's nuclear capacity.
Right.
In fact, the nuclear technology is a gift from China. And in CPEC, it gave, this is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it promised $46 billion. It has actually given only $23 billion. Much of it is in terms of loans.
Right.
And it has extracted a commitment by Pakistan government of 17% return to China in dollar terms.
Okay.
Now, this is unheard of, and this will suck the Pakistani army dry because this is a very high rate of return,
Right.
and that too for in dollars.
Right.
In last few years, the flow of Chinese money to Pakistan has slowed down because the Chinese don't like to write free checks.
Yes.
They are careful with their money. So they have agreed to roll over the debt. Unlike Americans and the Saudis and the Gulf and UAE, they don't write off the debt.
Right.
So it's a situation where, they are cautious.
Yes.
And you'd have seen that despite all the talk of, being the Iron Brother, and they, of course, gave help to Pakistan, even in Operation Sindoor, but they did not directly intervene, which is what Pakistan has been hoping. They wanted China to intervene militarily in 65,
Yes.
in 71 war, and China always kept away.
Right.
So they know where to draw the line.
Correct. So all in all, I think the future does not really looks good for Pakistan, and I think your book, which provided a lot of historical insights as well as an understanding of the current situation. Let's hope that we have a Pakistan which helps India and Pakistan to grow together. And Ambassador Srivastava, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It was a pleasure talking to you and hearing so much insights from you on Pakistan.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you, sir. So this was Ambassador Srivastava, who shared a lot of critical insights on Pakistan and Kashmir. Any serious reader of Pakistan and Kashmir, I strongly recommend these two books by Ambassador Srivastava. If you are interested in knowing about Pakistan, you cannot afford misreading these books. Thank you very much for watching this podcast and subscribe to my channel for more such podcasts. Thank you.